And so many times when we choose to use the characteristics of God that have already been placed in us, like goodness, generosity, courage, gratitude, the one I've been harping on. When we exhibit those, it opens huge doors for conversation and culture.
All right, well, welcome to another episode of Resisting Pretense. We're having honest conversations about a life of faith in modern culture. And hopefully, if we've done our job right at the end of this, it might inspire you to have some faith-infused conversations in your world. And today we're jumping into we kind of fell into this conversation, I think, last week and thought it would be really interesting for the podcast about loyalty. Loyalty and commitment. Oh, by the way, I'm Tom.
And I'm Scott.
We're your hosts for the day and every other day on this podcast. But loyalty and commitment, this is one of those things where, from my observation, it's a place where our cultural values, where our culture is at, has begun to seep into people of faith into their values in a way that's not so good. I feel like loyalty is a declining value in our culture, but should not be a declining value in our faith. And so there's a struggle there.
Well, and I think we have come to a place in culture where if life gets difficult, if it gets painful,
peace out.
Yeah, I'm out. I can go somewhere else and not have to deal with this. And I think that's true. You know, you can look across employers or families or the church or marriages or whatever and kind of go.
We lost 7 listeners, right?
Yeah. So
we only had 8.
Stay loyal with us, the one.
Yeah, please. I mean, even get down to simple things like restaurants. You know, people sometimes would have a restaurant that's like their place where they go, and then they get treated poorly once. They're like, I'm never going back there again. I don't know why they have to sound like that, but
because we're grumpy old men.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's you're right. It's not even if they don't get treated right, if the food didn't come out right or the drinks weren't fast enough, or we look for all these reasons to say I'm out instead of saying I'm in. And you made a really good point in this when we began this conversation about, instead of saying I'm out, I'm never going back to that restaurant, you had a better solution. Do you remember what it was?
I can remember it.
So you're, and let me see if I can spark your memory, but it was to the idea of, what if I would just say, hey, can I set it up an appointment with the manager? Just hey, I love your restaurant. I love what you do. I just wanted to share this one event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still don't remember that.
It was a good idea, though.
I thought it was your idea.
No, that was
you
yours.
said it.
Just now, you're correct.
But yeah, let's kind of dig into some of the specifics, the way we see it play out. So we're talking about in employment. There seems, I don't have figures or numbers, research, whatever, but anecdotally, it seems like there's a decline in people staying with one employer for long periods of time, and it's kind of like once I can find a better offer, I'm gonna jump ship. And you had an interesting perspective. It's on both sides.
Yeah, I think that sometimes employees feel like the company is not loyal to them, is not supporting them in the way that a company should. And so they don't feel any loyalty from the company. So it's like that, well, if you're not going to be loyal to me, why should I be loyal to you?
Right. And I would say that there's definitely an element of loyalty that is mixed up with conflict resolution, which I also think is like a dying art in our culture. But um, you persist in loyalty by not by not having conflicts, but by working through them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if if you work for an employer and you feel like, man, I've proven myself here, I've done well, and and I didn't get the raise I wanted, or I didn't get the promotion I wanted, um, often we don't cycle back around and say, hey, I was frustrated that I didn't get this. I feel like, you know, based on this reason, this reason, this reason, I deserve that consideration. What is it that you're not seeing from me that I need to do? And having that very direct conversation, um, which is an expression of loyalty. Like, I want to, I value being here. And it's valuable enough to me to have a difficult, direct conversation in order to stay here, stay loyal, and continue building this relationship. That's the other thing. I mean, it's conflict resolution, but it's also relational development. That if at the first sign of difficulty we're out, then loyalty will never develop. Whether it's in, employment, with your friends, whatever.
Well, the other side of that, though, is that not only is a conflict resolution and the development of relationship, but it can't be in proportion to my entitlement.
Ooh.
That I am entitled to this and you are giving it, so I'm not going to remain loyal. And so we get into this conflict of it's unfair, so I don't have to stay in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not always the case. That's not always, and so I think that when we begin to look at where does that loyalty come from, it comes from that relationship. It comes from, and obviously along with that then becomes grace and forgiveness and those kinds of things. But, when we're talking about employer, would I like more money? Sure. Everybody would like more money. But is the person who's giving me the raise or not giving me the raise even capable of giving me more money? Is there somebody above them that can't do it? And is there a place where I have to say, I get it, I can only get this much because of these things, versus I feel like I'm worth more, but I get that you can't pay me more. And pay's easy to pick on.
Right. I think there's an overall principle of enduring difficulty for greater reward. And if all you really want, and I'll stay in that, wage space, if all you really want is the next $1 an hour raise, you can keep hopping and hopping and hopping until you find the place that will pay you the most. And then maybe you'll settle there for a while. But what you're missing is the process of developing a relationship with an employer whom you value, what they're doing, how they do it, whether or not they pay the most. You're valuing, how they operate, and you're committing to say, I want to be a part of that. And if I will endure the difficulty of maybe not, of making $1 less an hour for the greater reward of a very healthy, strong relationship with my employer, it may be that 10 years from now, I'm making more at this place than I ever would at the place that would have paid me $1 an hour more at the beginning, because all they're really interested is in getting people in the door, but they may or may not be interested in developing them the way that the employer that you respect, that maybe pays a little less, will over time develop people because you respect them for those kind of reasons.
Well, and I think it goes even a step back from that loyalty comes first and foremost from a heart of gratitude, a heart that says, I'm grateful that I have a job. I'm grateful that I am employed. I'm grateful that you've given me this chance to prove myself in your organization. And whether you're talking employer or friends or church or marriages or whatever, it in my perspective, it starts with that. I'm grateful that I'm even here. I'm grateful that I get to be a part. And so many times we don't see that gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with you earlier about how I see this in the NFL, that
Yeah.
that when I was in my teens, the players were loyal to their teams. They were like proud. I'm a Bronco. I'm a Raider. I'm a cheesehead. Whatever it is, this is
Mm-hmm.
my team. I
Often for a whole career.
often for the whole career. They were like, this is my city, and I'm fighting for my city. And then, probably a decade and a half later, we begin to see this idea of contract renegotiation, and I can make more money at this team, and you know, and so I find myself in a place of having a much higher level of respect for players who say, I'm staying with my team. Yeah, you're offering me more money, but I am a Bronco. I am a Raider. I am a Cowboy. You know, I
Right.
I actually see more loyalty in fans than I do in players now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was thinking just as you were talking now, when I was a kid, I think it was the exception that a player changed teams. That was the exception rather than the like most players it seems stayed on the same team. And then occasionally there would be a guy that would move from another, but I think about like, my growing up years, Danny White, Cowboys, Joe Montana, 49ers. And it was only like the only time people kind of changed teams, not the only time, but one of the typical times people would change teams is when they were a star like a Joe Montana and they were kind of fading towards the end of their career and they really lost their starting position on the team that they had spent their whole career with. And so some other, and they may be at the end of their contract and some other team that was not as successful would recruit them to come in and kind of help them turn things around by bringing their experience and all that. And so I think if I remember correctly, didn't Joe Montana play like 1 or 2 years for I don't know who it was, I don't remember who it was, but some other team, very briefly at the end of his career, that kind of thing. Um, and now it seems like it's the exception for a player to stay with one team
Mm-hmm.
for most of their career. And that, again, no data. I got no data except that just the observation that it's not unusual to see one guy that was a receiver for this team this year is now a receiver for another team, or he was a running back for one team and now he's on another team. It seems like the quarterbacks stay a little longer typically, um, if they're successful. But if they're kind of middle of the pack, they might be jumping around.
And it probably depends on where the spotlight is. I mean, there may
Right.
be a ton of linemen that have worked for the team that they started with and always have been loyal to that team.
Right.
But you don't hear a lot of times about the amazing tackle that has, is ready to trade teams. It's not like, yeah, I've reached my salary cap as a tackle and I need
The
a
linemen
guard.
do everything right. I'm just telling you right now. The last thing I want is some angry lineman that
Yeah.
that somebody said, there's a podcast about saying you're not loyal. Like, no, all the linemen are loyal and great, and we love them. So moving on.
But it plays on into other relationships. And I
Right.
think that was one of the
Absolutely.
things that you and I talked about was how important those relationships were. That, you know, just because life has gotten hard in that relationship doesn't mean that the relationship is bad or that you need to jump out of it. But that maybe you need to stay in and learn something. Maybe there's something that God is trying to teach you through this difficult season. Um, I remember I was ready to quit my job, and a very wise man said to me, you need to stay and work through it because God is trying to teach you something through this.
Mm.
And he was absolutely correct. I then ended up staying for another uh, 5 or 7 years after that with that organization because of his wise advice. But I remember being in our role, I don't know how many married couples we end up talking to because their marriage has gotten difficult, and they come in almost with the attitude of, I didn't sign up for this.
I didn't sign up for difficult. Yeah. It was like the first real significant difficulty. And then it's like, well, I said for better or for worse. But what I meant was as long as it stays easy.
As long as it's better. It doesn't have, if it gets worse, then I'm going to go find a new.
Right. And there's this resolve that we need to see it through, to see through difficulties, and to stay loyal to relationships, to employers. And in faith life, there's a big trend of people just hopping to the church that's kind of most interesting right now. And it's concerning to me. And there's fundamentally a church is a family. And if you're going to commit to a family, that, in my opinion, there should be a loyalty to that family, and an acknowledgement that, sometimes things go my way in my family, sometimes they don't. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't. But I'm committed to being a part of the family, to adding value to the family, and I feel like that perspective of church is under fire in our culture. A lot of people now think of the church less as a family and more as like a provider of religious goods and services. And so if I feel like there's a better product somewhere else, they have better musicians, or they have better teaching, or they have a better program for my kids, or they have a better, their chairs are more comfortable, or whatever it is, that we're just shopping for better religious products. That's concerning to me, because it's a change in values. I would love it if every church had the greatest speaker and the greatest music and the greatest chairs and the greatest everything else, but it is fundamentally a family.
Well, and I think it comes back to that idea of entitlement. My ears are entitled to better music. My butt's entitled to a better chair. My brain is entitled to better teaching. And the sad thing is that
you can get all that stuff off the internet.
Well, and in any kind of a loyal, committed relationship, I don't care what kind it is, whether you're talking employee, friends, church, whatever, things change. And you don't just leave because things change.
Right.
If you are committed to it, that means I'm going to be a part of what's going on. I'm going to speak up when I don't agree with what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to work on this together, not in opposition, because we are working towards something together that is better. And so what happens is that what I am used to gets changed. It's like, I'm going to get out now because, my butt's tired, or.
Right. And it's not just, it can be what I'm used to, or something's changed, or it can be something like I had an expectation that didn't get met. So I wanted things to go this way. It's not that it changed, it just never got to where I was wanting it to go. So, no, I'm tired of waiting. I'm out. And I think the cultural value of entitlement is very much tied to our sense of rights and freedoms. And I get it. I'm an American. I grew up an American. Don't tread on my rights. I get it. I'm invested in my rights, and I am appreciative of the rights that I have. But when I start feeling like everything should be handed to me because I have rights and because freedom is more important to me than anything else, there's something very subtly different in that cultural value than there is in because my faith teaches me that my rights really aren't that my faith teaches me sacrifice. My faith teaches me humility. My faith teaches me to to think more of others, to value others, and to place their needs as prominent in my life, and to do that. And so my faith teaches sacrifice a lot out of love and compassion, whereas my culture teaches rights, which is beautiful, but also can lead to this idea of entitlement. And so those are these underlying values in tension, um, and what I see that I'm just concerned about.
Well, and my God teaches me loyalty and commitment.
Mm-hmm.
When we
I'm so grateful.
just when we talk about, anywhere from when we go from Genesis to Revelation, we see this God that's constantly saying, come back. I'm faithful to you. I'm loyal to you. I'm going to give you what you need. Just stick with me. Be here with me, and I will take care of you. And when we stray away, he's still like, come back. You're one of my 100. You're one of my sheep. You're the one I want to be in my flock. And he's constantly in this commitment, loyal, I love you part of it. And it's a part that when we say we want to emulate the characteristics of our God, that's one of the biggest ones.
Right. And I got to be fair. There is a time to separate. There's a time, loyalty would demand of us that we have this resolve to see it through, to try to help things improve when we're in a situation whether it's maybe uncomfortable or difficult, and to, if you're part of a church family and it's struggling, to be a part of the solution. But there is a moment at some point where you have to say, this went from uncomfortable to unhealthy, or this went from difficult to just flat wrong. And it's not about, at some point it's okay to say, I need to make a change. And so I'm not saying it never happens. I'm not saying you never leave your employer, you never leave your church, you never end a friendship, you never stop going to a restaurant. But it's a question of, is it our first inclination to just have a difficulty and just drop everything and jump ship? Or is it our last resort? And I generally think we ought to be willing to go through the difficulty to see resolution. And if we can't get there, then say, I think maybe it's time for me to make a change. But I'm not convinced we do that much in our culture anymore.
Well, and I think that we have to move through that difficulty to say, is it about me or is it about them? Because if it's about me, then I have to ask the question, am I even grateful for what I have in this situation? Is there something I could be working on to help? Is there something I need to be engaged in? And I think you bring up a really good point, because there are parts in friendships or in marriages or employment where you have to say, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And it's because I have been put in a position that is no longer safe. It's no longer healthy. It's no longer God-filled or spirit-filled. And there's a point where you have to say, okay, it's time to cut. It's time to put a pause in the relationship. But sometimes I think we say, well, I'm never going to go back, or I'm never going to. And that was one thing that we see in Scripture so many times, is that God would put a pause in the relationship, but he would never say never again.
Right.
He would say, okay, I'm going to, and it may be long pauses,
Sure.
God left the Israelites in Egypt for 400 years.
And then in the desert for another 40.
And so he put pauses in, but he never said, I'm done with you. I'm completely done with you. There was always a time of change and repentance and bringing back.
Yeah. I think one of the issues we need to look at and trying to decide, when is that moment of saying, of moving on or separating, and for me, at least in part, it's a matter of is this an issue of preference or relationship? You know, if am I willing to just dump a relationship because of preference? Then for me, that's not a compelling enough reason to walk away. There's a lot of things in life that I would prefer to be different. That's not a reason to violate the value of relationships. And I think, again, culturally, we're at a place in the development of our culture where people are so attached to their rights, their freedoms, their entitlement, that their relationships often take second place. That's a worry to me about what does that mean for our culture moving forward, because at some point we have to value the relationships we have with neighbors, with our community, with our, with our region, our state, and say, it's not my preference to have this ordinance in my city, but I'm going to vote for it because ultimately I think it will benefit the whole. I don't want it, but I can see that some people really need it, and so that kind of thing. And just in a political space of like voting for something, I think a lot of people just purely only vote for what's my preference, and negate the value of the relationships that we're in. You're in a relationship with, your family, your friends, your employer, your church, your whatever, all the people that you chose relationship with. But there's also relationships you never chose, but that doesn't mean they're not relationships. You have a relationship with your neighbors. You have a relationship with your community. You have a relationship, with the school that your kids go to. And then those aren't relationships you necessarily chose, but they're still there. And there's a loyalty of, I want to do my part to bring the best value to this relationship that I'm in, whether I chose it or not. And there is something important, I think, about people of faith in contrast to people in our culture that don't have that faith, of modeling, no, these relationships are important, not just to you individually, but into our culture as a whole. Like we can't stop denying the value of relationships and think it's going to go well.
I also think that there is a contagious aspect to commitment in the idea that if I'm in any of these relationships and I say, no, I'm going to fight for this, I'm going to be in, there's automatically this thing that's like, oh yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we do need to fight for this. Maybe there is something deeper and more connected. And the thing is about commitment and relationships is that we enter into the relationship, and once we're into the relationship, there is a period of exposure. And that exposure will either say we agree with each other or don't agree with each other. But at that point of exposure, we have to make a decision. Are we going to continue to commit? If I go to a restaurant for the first time and my food is cold and my wait person is horrible and things are bad about it, I may not commit to that relationship with that restaurant.
Right.
But if I've been going to that restaurant for years and one day the food is cold and the wait person is bad, I might go, okay, wait a minute, I need to go back and talk to this restaurant.
Or see if it was an off day.
It might have been an off day.
But if it continues,
I might have been having an off day, whatever that looks like. But there's a place where that, because of that exposure, it can create a break in the relationship. And we have to choose, are we going to repent for my part of whatever's in it? Am I going to work towards reconciliation? And when that happens, we enter into a new phase of relationship, a very joyous part of relationship. We also enter into a new phase of exposure. Now I'm going to expose myself a little deeper. And I think it's important that, and I forgot where I was going with this, but I think it's important for us to realize that that's a part of the cycle. That's the part of commitment that steps in.
Yeah. And of course, we see this a ton in the scripture. We see, um, a loyalty and a faithfulness to the faith community. And in the Old Testament, we see a loyalty to God's people, to Israel. Um, we see this pattern of enduring difficulty for greater reward. Paul, if Paul just lived on preference, I'm pretty sure he would have preferred not to be beaten.
Yeah, bet he would.
Not to be imprisoned, not to be, those are things that he endured the difficulty for the greater reward at the end. I mean, that's like every prophet in the Bible endured difficulty for greater reward. Frankly, the whole early church, I mean, they were a mess of trying to figure out this whole new thing of following Jesus and being in community together. And there were lots of ups and downs, and there was a lot of trial and error of figuring this out as they went, but they endured the difficulty for greater reward. And Jesus, for our benefit, endured great difficulty for much greater reward. And I think that's something that we need to cycle back to and remember, or else our culture will constantly bombard us with the message: you have rights, you have freedom, you're entitled to this, you should get the best of everything. And we will constantly, like, that's not going to end. We're going to get those messages over and over and over. And the hard thing is that there's truths in there.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to balance that with, yeah, but I'm also going to be a person of humility, person of sacrifice, person who values relationship, person who values compassion and love and reconciling. And we're going to need to provide our own balance, because I don't think our culture will for quite some time.
We often talk here at our church at Stone Ridge about our 4 values:
Mm-hmm.
Goodness, gratitude, generosity, and courage. And all 4 of those are truly required in a committed relationship.
Right.
I think about Paul sitting in a prison chained to the floor. Probably the last thing I would be doing is singing praise songs.
Yeah.
But here is a guy who was just so grateful for his salvation that he was going to praise God no matter what the circumstance was. And then he was going to speak the truth about Jesus. So here's a guy who's both got gratitude, he's got courage. He speaks the truth in love. There's a goodness about how he does it. And then the generosity of grace, the generosity of these were all things he had to learn. These were all things. It wasn't just like he was like, oh, the scales came off and he was instantly endowed with all of this stuff. It was kind of like the idea of, he struggled with John Mark, but then in the end called for him.
Right. Yeah, the Paul in prison thing. You mentioned the gratitude and the courage, but for me, when God showed up in power and released them, it could have been Paul and Silas like, sweet, peace out, we're going. It could have been them running down the street trying to get away. But the manager of the prison goes down and he's thinking, oh, I'm in trouble. All of my detainees got away. And Paul and Silas like, hey, we're still here. It's all right. I mean, that was a goodness choice of, they still had to account for whatever got them there, even though it was unfair, but they had to account for what got them there. And so they stayed and faced the music, and eventually they were released, because they knew they were in the right. And so that was a choice of goodness. And then the fact that the guy who had essentially taken over their imprisonment, they sat down and shared with him about Jesus and led that whole family to Jesus, and and said, you were our jailer, now you're our brother. And wow, what a generous attitude towards them. So yeah, you see all of those qualities in that little exchange. And most people in our culture would have been like Prison door got left open. I'm out. There's no loyalty. That's a bold statement. That's too strong a statement.
Yeah.
There, there's very little expressions of the kind of loyalty that we see in Paul in our current modern culture.
Well, and I think the beauty of that, and it goes right into what we're talking about, is that the commitment to Jesus in that moment and what he was doing as a faith person changed the culture
Hmm.
with the guard.
Right.
And so many times when we choose to use the characteristics of God that have already been placed in us, like goodness, generosity, courage, what did I miss? Goodness,
Goodness, generosity, courage, gratitude.
gratitude. The one I've been harping on. Um, when we exhibit those, it opens huge doors for conversation and culture.
Well, yeah, and I don't know if we've talked about this yet on the podcast, but I have this visual picture in my mind. Have you ever seen like a person holding a lantern on a foggy night? And so it lights up the fog around them, and then it's dark past the boundaries of their light. It's kind of dark. I think of followers of Jesus kind of like that in culture. Like we're this little island of light, and we radiate a certain effect around us, and we change the reality around us. We as we bring the qualities that Jesus puts in us. So as we can be this little walking island of gratitude and courage and generosity and goodness, and it affects the world around us. And the more of us there are in a vicinity, the more, the more that light kind of covers that area. But wherever we go, like sometimes it's just like one lonely one lonely Christian, kind of being that representative of the kingdom of God in a very dark place. And it can be a lonely thing, but also a very beautiful thing when that light goes into a dark place, and then people catch on, and they're like, "Ooh, that's really nice." Having that, like that expression, that person who's grateful in a way that I like expect, and it can become catchy. You mentioned how that loyalty is kind of what's the word? Catchy, but
Contagious.
I watched football my entire life as a kid. For some reason, as an adult, I haven't sustained that.
You're talking about American football.
American football. Yeah. I watch worldwide football all the time. But American football, I just kind of stopped watching as an adult, except for like if somebody invites me to their house to watch a game, I would go and I would enjoy it. And Super Bowl is always like, we're always going to watch the Super Bowl. And it's funny, sometimes if I go to a Super Bowl party and I don't have a preference for either team, like if it was the Ravens and the Buccaneers, I don't really care who wins. But if there is a rabid Buccaneers fan at that party, I kind of get drawn in. Like, their enthusiasm, their loyalty to it is infectious. It's contagious, and it kind of, and they're, of course, they're talking about, oh, that guy's amazing, and he does, I think he's the best in that role in anywhere. Like, he's so underrated, but he's so amazing, and so I begin to see things about that team, and I'm like, oh wow, yeah, it actually is really good, and and that kind of loyalty is contagious, and I think when we can embrace it and be proud of it and understand why it's important, why it matters, that it's about relationship, and we can kind of be like, stand our ground and say, no, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to work through the difficulty to get to the great reward, then I think that becomes something that's admirable, that people can appreciate. So I hope that's what we take away from this.
Well, yeah, it was interesting when you were talking about the light. I'm just going to add this little part and to back up just a little bit. But I have this camp light and it's just a small round thing, but you raise the top to give or release more light.
Mm-hmm.
And so the closer it is to the bottom, the less light it is.
Got it.
The more we raise it up, the more light goes out. And I think that's the idea of this idea of commitment and loyalty, is that the more light we shine, the more of the light of Jesus we shine, the more we see commitment and loyalty contagious.
Right.
But when we keep it small and we there's very little light, people aren't drawn to it. But when we shine brightly, people are drawn, and they go, I want what you have. Teach me that loyalty. Teach me that commitment. Teach me, show me where this came from.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, we're still unofficially
sponsored
by Diet Coke, and we will remain loyal to our unofficial sponsor, even though they have not offered us an official sponsorship. I suppose we might need to request that. I don't know.
Probably.
Do you think? I would think they've had heard about us by now.
I think when we get to 9 listeners, we'll consider that.
Maybe 10.
Okay.
Round number.
That works.
It really shows something. So loyally, unofficially sponsored by Diet Coke, we are very glad to share this time with you, and we hope that you will strive to represent the loyalty and commitment that is a part of our values as followers of Jesus, as people of relationship, and we hope it spurs some conversation for you. Thanks for joining us.
Have a great day.